Well, hello and welcome. Coming to you from the NC State Hunt Library today. Thank you very much for joining me. Let's talk about Chapter 3 from Thompson et al. 2019, all about evaluating the external environment of an organisation. So this chapter is going to help you to understand the broad macro environmental factors that have strategic significance. You're going to learn to use analytical tools that will help you diagnose the competitive conditions in an industry. You're going to learn how to map the market positions of key groups of industry rivals. And you're going to learn how to determine whether an industry's outlook is attractive or not. You'll learn, okay, so let's talk about, let me just go back one. Did I skip? No, that's good. All right, just making sure I didn't skip one there. Okay, so figure 3.1 is all about showing you how to analyze the company's situation and to choose a strategy. So you analyze that macro environment, considering macro environmental factors such as political factors, economic factors, social trends, and technological trends. So your Pest Framework is a nice, easy way to start there. It's not comprehensive, but it's a good start. And then we're going to analyze the internal environment. So a SWOT analysis is a good tool to use there, looking at the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats that an organisation faces. And from there, we're going to develop, right, what's a good strategic vision? What's a good direction for this company to head? We can look at various alternatives in terms of strategic options, and then we select the best one. Okay, so here's the Pest Framework, which, PESTEL is another way to consider it. So P for political, E for economic, E also for environmental, S for social and cultural, T for technological, and L for legal. So these factors are what needs to be considered to analyse that macro environmental context. So this graphic, we'll talk a little bit more about it in class, but basically we've got the PESTEL factors on the broad macro environment, and then internally we've got suppliers and competitions and buyers as well as substitute products to consider. These are about evaluating the industry, and then internally for the company we need to look at strengths and weaknesses, for example. So when we assess the industry, we think about using the 5 forces framework, and that comes from Michael Porter. If you don't know what that is, read up in the book and we'll talk about it more in class. We need to think strategically about the value net of the organisation, what driving forces are going on in the industry, so what industry trends are happening, who are the most powerful strategic groups, who are our competitors and what are they offering, how are they positioned in the marketplace, and then what are the industry key success factors. All right, so 5 forces. This comes from Michael Porter, as I mentioned, and we are going to talk about more in class, but we're going to look at competition from our rivals. We're going to look at the emergence of new entrants, and we're going to look at the competition from producers of substitute products. So here we're now looking at direct and indirect competition. What's the bargaining power of the suppliers and what's the bargaining power of the customers? So these 5 forces collectively are an analytical tool to understand the industry attractiveness. Do we want to go into this industry? Do we want to redefine which industry that we're in? So for each of the 5 forces, you're going to identify the actors involved, and then you're going to look at the factors that are bringing about the competitive pressures. You've got to evaluate how strong those pressures are, and then determine the industry attractiveness, the industry profitability. So competitive pressures that increase competition is about buyer demand that is slowing or declining, because that means it's becoming less costly for buyers to switch brands. And industry products become less differentiated in a mature market. The products become commodified almost, and there is unused production capacity, or products have high fixed costs and high storage costs. So the number of competitors is increasing, and that increases competitive pressure. The diversity of competitors increasing also increases competitive pressure. And then high exit barriers stop organisations from actually leaving the industry. So these 5 factors are what we use to identify and analyse industry attractiveness collectively. And the fierceness of competitive rivalry. You know, if it's fierce competition, do you actually want to get into that war, into that battle? It's going to cost money to do well. So do you want to go there or not? So competitive pressures associated with the threat of new entrants. Entry threat considerations include expected defensive reactions of current organisations that are in the sector, strength of barriers to entry. So if you're looking at starting an airline, for example, it's not actually the aircraft that is the biggest barrier to entry, it's the terminal port placement. To get access, you've got to have the airport to give you permission, and many times that may well be political and blocked. The attractiveness of a particular market's growth in terms of demand and potential profit. This is what a new entrant may need to consider. As well, what capabilities and resources are the potential entrants bringing to this battleground? Existing competitors in the market space, what sort of competitive pressure are they facing? Do you want to take that on or not? Also, we need to look at the sizable economies of scale in terms of production and distribution and advertising and other activities. We need to look at the learning curve, you know, like is there much tacit knowledge? You have to know what you're doing, or can you learn this quickly? So there's cost advantages to those who are already in the battleground. Customer loyalty and strong brand preferences may also be a barrier to entry. Organisations that are in the system, in the industry, they may hold intellectual property rights that will block new entrants, or at least make it hard or a high barrier for new entrants to come in. So distribution, for example, happens through networks more strongly in some countries such as Japan and China, and these network effects influence customer demand. If you can't tap into those networks, then you're not going to make it. Some industries will be more capital intensive than others. You may need to build not only customer networks, but also distributor and dealer networks. And there may be regulations that are going to block new entrants. All right, so let's look at the factors affecting the sellers of the substitute products. Substitute product considerations include how readily available, how attractively priced are these substitute products? Are they comparable in terms of quality, performance, and other evaluative criteria? Do they offer switching costs to buyers, as some mobile phone retailers will do? As some Okay, so then indicators of substitute competitive strengths. Is there an increasing rate of growth in the sale of substitutes? Are substitute producers adding new output capacity? Is there increasing profitability for the substitute producers? And so these are examples of factors or indicators that we will use to identify whether the substitutes have a high competitive strength or not. All right, let's look at the competitive pressures stemming from supplier bargaining power. So supplier bargaining power depends on the strength of demand for and availability of their supply products. It also depends on whether suppliers provide a differentiated input and whether or not that enhances the performance of the product. Industry members' costs for switching among the suppliers may enable them strong bargaining power or not. There is a size and a number of suppliers relative to the industry, supply industry, and relative to the industry members, right? So relative to the number of current competing organisations, and if there's a lot of suppliers, then any single one of those suppliers does not have a bargaining power, a high bargaining power. But if they act collectively, if they've collectively got common interests, then together they can have a high bargaining power. Or maybe there's a small number of suppliers that are supplying to a particular industry, and if there's like only one or two suppliers, then they get to say what goes because they hold the power. So there is the possibility of an industry member, and in other words, an organisation that is operating in the industry, to backwardly integrate into the suppliers industry. But there's a risk attached to that, because that means that they're stepping away from their core competence. What they are good at, what that organisation is known for, may not extend into being able to acquire or merge with a supply organisation. So there's a fraction of cost of the supplier's product relative to the total cost of the industry product. So how high is that fraction that the supplier is providing? Is it is it highly dependent on that supplier? Do you actually need that part? Or do you have alternatives? So the availability of good substitutes for whatever that supplier is providing will lessen their bargaining power. We also need to look at whether the industry members are major customers of the suppliers. So if a particular supplier only services and supplies to one organisation, then that organisation holds the power, not the supplier. All right, let's look at the bargaining power from buyers now. So the strength of demand for the seller's product, right? So like I was saying, if there's an organisation that is demanding 100% of this supplier's products, then without that buyer, this supplier is done for. And so that supplier is very highly dependent on that buyer, and the buyer has a high bargaining power. The degree to which the industry goods are differentiated. All right, so we're looking at the pressure from the buyer and how price sensitive they are how differentiated those goods are. So does this give buyer bargaining power or not? Can we buy from this supplier, or can we buy from that supplier because they've got a better price, for example? There may be costs involved. Maybe we're going to need a different conveyor belt to accommodate a different supplier. That means the buyer is going to incur switching costs to switch from this supplier to that supplier. The number and size of buyers relative to the number and buyer of sellers. This will help us determine high or low bargaining power. We need to look at the threat of buyers integration. So like, is there any chance that an organisation will backward integrate into the supplier's industry? What about the buyer's knowledge of the products and costs and the pricing? You know, maybe it's a highly complex product and the buyer is the industry expert on that, not the seller, and therefore the buyer holds the power, not the seller. The buyer may hold the discretion in terms of delaying purchases, and this will be highly costly for the supplier, especially if they're not doing a just-in-time distribution strategy as we are doing with the drones. What about the buyer's sensitivity? Because they've got, a low profit margin. Maybe what happens if they don't get their goods on time? Then they may be willing to pay a higher price to get the products when they need them. Maybe they're making a large purchase and so they can negotiate a lower price. Product quality, not at issue because price is the primary concern when we're looking at this bargaining power. But of course, if you want a quality product, that buyer is going to have to pay for it. All right, now together, these 5 competitive forces are conducive to industry attractiveness and good profitability. We'll work on these questions in class. We're going to match the company strategy to the competitive conditions because that is going to help us in pursuing and protecting the firm from as many competitive pressures as we can, and it's also going to initiate actions calculated to shift competitive forces. So maybe, in other words, if we know that this is what we want to do, but because the competitive forces are what they are and the competitive dynamics are what they are, we're going to move slightly further this way so that we can pull back when the competitors retaliate. All right, so how the value net differs from the 5 forces. The value net focuses on the interactions of industry participants with a particular organisation as the focus. It defines the category of competitors to include who are the direct competitors. So we started talking about this last week, how is it that Google is competing with Microsoft? How did that come to be? Because Google is primarily a search engine and Microsoft is primarily a software provider. And so what's happened is that Google Chrome, for example, they've used a product development strategy to deliver a range of apps that mean that now they're in competition with that primary Microsoft Office suite. So how you define which industry you're in renders which competitors you're competing against, and therefore what strategy you may or may not choose to enact. When you're introducing a new category of industry participants, producers of the products enhance the value of the focal firm's products when they are used together. Okay, so the value net introduces a new category of industry participant and those that complement that participant and producers of products that enhance the value of the firm when they are used together. So we're looking at value net there. Here's a graphic of the value net, right? So we're talking about the influence of the customers together with the influence of the suppliers. These suppliers may well be supplying competitors, but there are complementers as well to consider. Industry dynamics and the forces driving change. Driving forces has 3 steps: identifying what the driving forces are, then we assess whether the drivers of change are acting to make the industry more or less attractive, and then we determine the strategy. So here we go with those 3 steps. Identify the forces driving the industry change. Here's some things to consider. Changes in the long-term industry growth rate, how's that? Is that going up or down? Have we got increases in terms of globalization for this particular product category? Are there new capabilities and applications emerging? What about the consumer trends, the buyer trends? Are there shifts in demographics there? Have we got technological change and manufacturing process innovations to consider? What about product and marketing innovations? Have we got new entrants that we need to consider, or exits of major firms? Is there a diffusion of technological know-how across the firms and the countries? What about changes in costs and efficiency? What's going on there? Consider the reductions in uncertainty and business risk, and look at the regulatory influences and the government policy changes. We also might want to consider societal values and lifestyles, whether that's changing and driving industry change. So then we assess these factors. So not all of those factors on the previous slide, not all of these may be relevant. There may be some factors that are more relevant than others, and we're going to assess these factors that drive the industry change. Let's talk about that in class. Okay. When we want to adjust our strategy so that we're more adequately coping as an organisation with the impact of driving forces, we need to consider what adjustments we're going to make, and do they need to be made immediately? Do we need to exit? Okay, so then we look at the strategic group analysis. Consists of those industry members with similar or competitive approaches and positions in the marketplace. So, who are the competitors with a comparable breadth of product line? Who amongst the competitors emphasises the same distribution channels? What is their technological approaches? Are they offering the same product attributes to buyers, or is the industry highly differentiated? Most times the answer is no, it's not. But then that's room for competitive advantage if that's the case. And the same goes with services. But one way to differentiate is through service augmentation, through offering a higher level of service orientation in order to do better than the competitors. So we use strategic group maps to assess the market positions of key competitors. We identify the competitive characteristics that delineate strategic approaches in the industry, and then we plot on a 2-axis map so that we see who is positioned where. That helps us to see where the gaps are in the market and where we may want to reposition to. So the standard positioning map uses price and quality, so price on the vertical axis, quality on the horizontal axis. Decide which industry you're operating in and plot where the competitors are. You also might want to use geography, geographic coverage, location as an evaluative criteria, maybe on the horizontal axis. The breadth of the product line that a competitor is offering, either wide or narrow. You can use that information to decipher who is positioned where in the marketplace and because of what they're offering. What about the degree of service? Again, put service quality or service augmentation on the horizontal axis. Distribution channels can be used as an evaluative criteria, and similarly focus or degree of diversification. When we create these strategic maps, what we are doing is selecting variables as the axis for the maps. So you want like high-low price, high-low quality. Variables should reflect whatever the industry is competing on. What's the primary evaluative criteria for the industry? They may be quantitative, discrete, but they might be defined in terms of class or combinations. That's really up to you who is plotting on the strategic map, but you who also is deciding which industry you're operating in and who your competitors are. So we plot where each competitor is positioned, and we're able to identify the industry structure. So here's an example of geographic coverage and price, and other variables too, considered on the vertical axis, geographic coverage on the horizontal axis. And here we have plotted various restaurants, casual dining industry. So that's the industry that we're operating in. So if we said, for example, the restaurant industry, then that's a very broad industry definition, and who we plot on this map would be above and beyond what is in this more narrowly defined industry, narrowly defined as casual dining. All right, so then we examine these market positions in the casual dining industry, and we ask ourselves which organisation is the most favourably positioned, and which organisation is most likely threatened by moves, and we'll do that in class. The value of these maps is that they're a very useful analytical tool, but not all maps are equally as useful or attractive. So competitive pressures from the industry's 5 forces might cause potential profit or strategic groupings to vary, and it may not be useful. To me, the industry definition has got a lot to do with whether or not it's useful, and same with the evaluative criteria. So, considering more in terms of competitor analysis, we need to have competitive intelligence, information about rivals that is useful in anticipating what our competitors may do next, and then signals of the likelihood of actually taking that action. So rivals who are under financial pressure, you might be more likely to anticipate what they are going to do, go in for a price war with price penetration strategy, for example. If you've got a new entrant coming in, they may well come in with a price skimming strategy, a very high price, so that they capture the early adopters in the market. Rivals seeking to increase market standing may invest, for example, in a heavy promotional campaign. Public statements of rivals' intentions can give us intelligence, and profiles can be developed by competitive intelligence units who basically dig, do the detective work. So here we've got the SAW framework. We've got this framework helps us to work out, analyze strategic moves by our competitors. So current strategy, that's the S. How is the company currently competing? What are their objectives? We can figure this out. What assumptions does this competitor hold about the industry? And what resources and capabilities do they bring to the table? And by analysing these things via the SAW framework, we can identify maybe which way the organisation is going to move. We can also look at key success factors, and these are strategy elements, product and service attributes, operational approaches, resources, competitive capabilities necessary for competitive success by any and all firms in an industry. Okay, so they are strategic elements that include product and service attributes, operational approaches, resources, competitive capabilities, and these key success factors are necessary for the organisational success. They vary from industry to industry, and some organisations may put a higher priority on particular success factors than others. They may also change over time and as market conditions change. So how do we know what the key success factors are? Well, we need to have an understanding, a comprehensive understanding of what the industry is, how it's defined, and what are the main competing forces in the industry. What's the main points of differentiation amongst competing brands, for example? So we need to identify, we need to do some analysis in the particular industry that we're operating in to identify key success factors that we want to focus on. So it's a decision. It's an organisational internal decision. There might be white reports that you can draw from, and there may be reports that give information on industry trends and industry outlooks. So an industry environment is fundamentally attractive if it presents an organisation with the opportunity for above average profit. An industry environment is fundamentally unattractive if the firm's potential is low profit. So we might want to think about exiting there. So factors to consider in assessing industry attractiveness: how the firm is impacted by the state of the environmental forces, whether strong competitive forces, so this is industry, the first point is about the macro environment, the second point is about the industry, are squeezing the industry profitability to subpar levels. Do you want to be in that industry? Whether the presence of complementors and the possibility of cooperative actions improve the company's prospects. So this is going to help us assess the industry attractiveness, whether industry profitability is favourable or unfavourable according to what forces we've analysed, whether the firm occupies a stronger market position than the competitors, and whether this is likely to change in the course of competitive interactions. In other words, are you going to be able to hold your ground, or are you going to get pummeled? How well is the firm's strategy going to deliver on what you've identified as the key success factors that you're going to focus on? So industry attractiveness is not the same if you analysed for different participants in the industry. Industry outsiders may conclude that they have the resources to overcome the barriers to entry for a particular industry. They recognise that people are making money in this industry, so they want to get in, but they underestimate and so that doesn't turn out well. And a particular industry's attractiveness depends in large part on whether the company has the resources and the capabilities to actually compete successfully and profitably in that environment. So last slide here, what should a current competitor decide about its industry? They just should decide whether what industry they are operating in, how attractive is that industry, whether or not they should invest aggressively, and what should their long-term competitive position be. When a strong competitor concludes that the industry is relatively unattractive and lacking opportunity, they may go into defensive position or exit. A competitively weak company in an unattractive industry is best to be looking for a buyer or exit strategy at least. So there you go, there is chapter 3 from the Hunt Library today, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you in week 4 with chapter 4. Lovely, thanks then, bye.